And we are joined today by the congressman from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, actually, I should really correct myself, because this race was called on election night, and it was called against you by the Associated Press, and then subsequently uncalled because of some 2,000 found votes.
Actually, it was called for me.
Oh, for you, pardon
and
me.
I was ahead. Yes, and I was ahead by 3,400 votes on election night, and then on the Friday after Election Day, when the so-called memory sticks of the voting machines were compared to the hand tabulations, there was almost a 4,000 vote swing. So I went from being ahead by about 3,400 votes to being down by almost 400 votes, with about 11,000 absentee and affidavit ballots still to count.
Okay, that must have been something of a shock.
It was, sure it was. I mean, I felt that, I felt that the 3,400 vote margin would hold up against the 11,000 absentees. But then when I learned that that number was a fiction, that was a real shock. Yes.
So what does it say about the new electronic voting machines? Actually, you spoke earlier today about the need to have all of the memory sticks in one location. But do you have actually confidence in these new machines? Because a lot of people in New York do not.
Well, all I can tell you is that the Suffolk County Board of Elections conducted the 3% audit that's required by the legislation that brought about these new machines. They certified the audit as clean, and they certified the machines as functioning properly. I have no evidence to countermand that. So I believe that the machines functioned accurately, but the way in which the votes were reported and then tabulated is what I'm told the problem was in our race. And so I think this notion of having the memory sticks go to a centralized location and then be tabulated that way, that makes much more sense and will reduce the opportunity for human error.
Were you surprised that Randy Altshuler conceded, because he had been raising money for what he thought was going to be a prolonged hand recount, and we are still seeing now in the county next door, Suffolk County, a state Senate race that has yet to be finally over?
Well, the race you're referring to is in Nassau County,
right.
And that race has been called by a judge, but now the Democrats are appealing that ruling of the judge. In our case, I mean, throughout this process, the people around Mr. Altshuler have said repeatedly that there was no need for a hand recount. And so when Randy called me this morning to concede, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised that he was calling today. But I mean, the numbers have not been going in his direction for a while now, and I think they finally recognized that there was no path forward in terms of what our lead was going into today and what the composition was of the ballots that were left to be counted. So I'm not surprised that he is not going to pursue a hand recount, but I was surprised that he called me today before we dealt with the last 1,100 or so ballots.
You also said this morning during the conference call with some reporters that eventually your margin will probably be somewhere between 500 and 600 votes. That's not very wide. But you also said that you don't think that you're going to change your approach significantly, which I found a little surprising. You're not going to change anything at all after this near miss?
I think you're actually not repeating what I said the way I said it. What I said was that I was not going to change my approach in terms of how hard I work, how accessible I am to the people who I represent, and how good a job we do both in terms of constituent service and in terms of partnering with other local elected officials to solve the problems of our district and to bring the federal government to the table to help solve local problems and help relieve local tax burden. I feel we've done that very, very well over the last 8 years. I want to continue on that path, and frankly, I believe that the reason that we won in such a difficult climate is because of the jobs we do on constituent service and on partnering with other local officials to solve problems. What what I also said was that my job is now going to change because I'm now in the minority.
Right.
And being in the minority is significantly different from being in the majority. And my job now is to do the best job I possibly can representing my constituents in terms of public policy, A, by picking my spots to try to influence legislation that's largely going to be written by the majority, to try to put into that legislation things that I think will be helpful to my district. And secondly, if the legislation is not supportive of the interests of my district, my job is to fight it as fiercely as I possibly can. And if it is supportive of my district, to support it as fiercely as I possibly can. So I'm not suggesting that I'm not going to change anything, but what I am suggesting is that the good things that I've done are why I was reelected, and I'm going to continue to do those.
You know, during the election, you also took some criticism for voting 90% of the time with Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, who's now outgoing. But she was reelected by the Democrats to continue serving as leader, although now, as you know, in the minority. Do you agree with that? Did you support her?
Did I support Nancy Pelosi for minority leader?
Right.
Is that your question?
Yes.
Yes, I did.
You did. Why?
Because I think she's a very good leader, and I think that the leadership team that we had in place with Speaker Pelosi and with Majority Leader Hoyer and Whip Clyburn is a good leadership team, and I also think that the 97% number that was used throughout the campaign is not a terribly illuminating number. I would much prefer to debate and to discuss my votes on specific issues of public policy. I'm happy to defend my votes, and I'm happy to actually recognize that a great many of those votes are going to turn out to be in the best interest of the American people. I mean, for example, you know, I and my fellow Democrats were attacked, you know, vigorously for having voted for TARP. TARP has turned out to be a great success, a great public policy success that has helped stabilize the banking industry and, in fact, thus far has returned a $21 billion profit to the taxpayer and ultimately will be largely repaid. So, I mean, I think that if we look at each individual piece of public policy, that's a much more fruitful discussion than taking a number that really doesn't have any real relevance.
Okay, so I would like to talk about a specific piece of public policy. That's the one that we're all sort of talking about now, and that's the middle-class tax cut deal that the president struck with the Republicans. Some of your Republican or your Democratic colleagues, rather, are being quite criticized, having a lot of criticism about this, and they say that they will not support it. In fact, Anthony Weiner was pretty blunt in saying he didn't think there was going to be a lot of Democratic votes. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I'm still working my way through it, and I want to see the legislative text. But there are pieces of it that I support, and have been on record for quite some time as supporting, and there are pieces of it that I'm really troubled by. I certainly support extending unemployment compensation. I think it's certainly a responsible thing to do to help people in need. It's also the most stimulative thing we can do in terms of putting money into the economy. I've voted to increase, or pardon me, to extend the so-called middle-class tax cuts. I have repeatedly voted to shield additional American families from the alternative minimum tax. So all of those things I support. I think this 2% payroll tax deduction is a very good idea and will turn out to be very stimulative. But where I differ, or where I have trouble, is extending the tax breaks to all earners. And I frankly thought that Senator Schumer had a very good idea by having the cutoff be not $250,000 for a family, but $1 million for a family. I think it's awful hard to argue for a tax break for families that make more than $1 million. And then secondly, the estate tax. I mean, the estate tax that I've voted for repeatedly is to keep in place the 2009 rates, which would shield 99.7% of American estates from the estate tax. And I really don't think it's a good idea for us to be crafting public policy to appeal to the wealthiest 0.3% of Americans.
But here's the problem, of course. The package is going to be a package in the end of the day. I mean, obviously.
I understand that.
Right. So when there's policy, you know, will you be able to hold your nose and say, okay, what I like outweighs what I don't like, and I am going to be able to vote for this?
that's the process of working my way through the legislation that I'm doing right now. As of right now, I am undecided, but at some point, I'm either going to be a yes or a no, and I'm going to decide that either the positives outweigh the negatives, or I'm going to decide that the negatives outweigh the positives. I'm certainly going to listen to my constituents on it, and I'm going to make a judgment that I think is in the best interest of the families I represent.
Because the president is under fire, from the left, obviously, with even some people suggesting that it would be good for him to be primaried by someone from the left in 2012. And do you believe, in fact, that he's abandoned the liberal wing of the Democratic Party?
I don't. I think he's in an extremely difficult position where he recognized that trade-offs were necessary, and he has put on the table a package that embodies those trade-offs. It's now our job to determine whether those trade-offs make good sense or whether they don't. And as I say, that's the process that I and my colleagues are currently working our way through. And by the way, there is consternation on the other side of the aisle as well. There are a great many of my Republican friends who are having a hard time swallowing $56 billion worth of unemployment insurance extension that isn't paid for and that adds to the deficit.
True.
So, I mean, all of us on both sides of the aisle are trying to work our way through this and figure out where the greater good lies.
Well, in the meantime, Congressman, I want to congratulate you again. 36 days is a long time to wait for a verdict in your race.
It is indeed.
Thanks very much for joining us, Tim Bishop.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for having me on. Thank you.